Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Aldo Moro and the year 1978. Let the weight of the day settle into your mattress. Imagine the soft, gray light of a Roman morning, long before the city is fully awake. It is the 16th of March, 1978. The air in the Triumphale district is crisp, carrying the faint, lingering chill of a winter that refuses to yield to the spring. A thin veil of mist clings to the cobblestones of the narrow streets, dampening the sound of the occasional passing car. In the quiet residence of Aldo Moro, a 61-year-old man of deep thought and heavy responsibility, the day begins with the rhythmic clinking of a silver spoon against a porcelain coffee cup. He is the president of the Christian Democracy Party, a man whose mind is currently occupied by the delicate threads of Italian politics. He prepares for a historic day, a day that promised to change the direction of a nation. His suit is pressed, the fabric dark and heavy, a tactile reminder of the gravity he carries within his role. He steps out into the cool morning, his breath visible in the air, unaware that the quietude of this residential sanctuary is about to be shattered forever. Two cars wait for him at the curb, their engines idling with a low, steady hum that vibrates through the soles of his shoes. The first is a deep blue Fiat 130, a stately saloon that reflects the muted morning sky in its polished chrome bumpers. Inside sits Domenico Rixai, the driver who has navigated these streets 1,000 times, and beside him, Orst Leonardi, a marshal of the Carabinieri and the head of Moro's security detail. Leonardi is a man of vigilance, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows of the doorways and the movement of the curtains in the upper windows. Behind them, a white Alfa Romeo Alfetta holds 3 more protectors, Francesco Zizzi, Giulio Rivera, and Rafael Iazzino. They are young men, their lives intertwined with the safety of the statesman in the car ahead. As the doors close with a heavy, muffled thud, the interior of the Fiat becomes a pocket of silence, smelling of old leather, paper, and the faint scent of the morning's news. The tires crunch slowly over the gravel, and then onto the smooth asphalt of Via Fani. The movement is rhythmic, a gentle swaying that could almost be mistaken for a lullaby if one did not know the destination. As the small convoy descends the gentle slope of Via Fani toward the intersection with Via Stresa, the geometry of the street feels unusually still. The residential buildings rise on either side, their shutters mostly closed, keeping the secrets of the sleeping families within. It is nearly 9 o'clock in the morning. At the corner, a white Fiat 128 with diplomatic plates is parked, seemingly waiting for a gap in the traffic. To a casual observer, it is just another morning in Rome, but if you listen closely, the silence is too thick. A woman stands on the corner holding a bunch of flowers, the petals bright and vibrant against the gray concrete. As Moro's car approaches, she makes a small, deliberate movement with the bouquet. It is a signal, a flash of color in the shadows that ignites a sequence of events. The white Fiat suddenly swerves into the path of Moro's car, the screech of tires echoing against the apartment walls. Domenico Rixai slams on the brakes, the blue Fiat jerking forward as it collides with the rear of the car ahead. Behind them, the escort car tries to maneuver, but they are trapped, pinned in a narrow corridor of steel and stone. The transition from the hum of an engine to the chaos of the ambush is instantaneous. From the shadows emerge figures dressed in the crisp, stolen uniforms of airline pilots. The visual is surreal, like a dream that has taken a dark turn. They move with a cold, practiced efficiency. The air is suddenly filled with the sharp, rhythmic staccato of automatic weapons. 91 bullets are fired in the span of less than 3 minutes, a duration that feels like an eternity in the stillness of the neighborhood. The sound of shattering glass is crystalline, the shards falling like diamonds onto the dark asphalt. The smell of gunpowder, acrid and metallic, replaces the morning mist. Inside the cars, the 5 brave men, Orst, Domenico, Francesco, Giulio, and Raphael, are caught in a storm they never had the chance to fight. 45 of those bullets find their marks. The blue Fiat is riddled with holes, the once-proud chrome now scarred. Amidst the smoke and the echoing gunfire, there is a terrible, final silence that falls over the escort car. The movement of the world seems to slow down, the light catching the drifting smoke as it rises toward the balconies above. In the heart of this devastation, the rear door of the blue Fiat is pulled open. Aldo Moro is still there, untouched by the bullets but enveloped in a shock that transcends the physical. His hands, perhaps still holding a briefcase filled with the documents of the state, are steady as he is led away from the wreckage. He is ushered into a waiting Fiat 132, a car that will become his mobile prison for the next few minutes. On the ground behind him, 5 leather bags lie scattered across the road. One contains his medicines, another his reserved documents, their pages fluttering in the light breeze like the wings of a grounded bird. The attackers vanish as quickly as they appeared, their tires screaming as they leave the intersection of Via Fani and Via Stresa. The street is left to the echo of the engines and the smell of the spent brass casings that litter the ground like copper rain. A neighbor looks out from a balcony, seeing the carnage below, the blue and white cars now tombstones in a residential garden. The heart of Italy has effectively stopped beating in those few seconds of violence. As the news begins to ripple outward, the silence that returns to Via Fani is heavy and suffocating. It is a silence that will haunt the country for 55 days. The mist has cleared, and the sun begins to warm the asphalt, but the shadows cast by the buildings seem longer, deeper than they were before. The 5 men who gave their lives remain in the stillness, their duty completed in the most tragic of ways. The nation wakes up to a different world, a world where the security of a statesman can be undone in a quiet morning ambush. For now, focus on the stillness of that street after the cars have gone. Imagine the drifting smoke settling, the way the light catches the broken glass on the road, and the absolute quiet of a moment that changed history. The morning is over, and a long, dark journey has begun. Feel the weight of your own surroundings, the safety of your room, and let the details of Via Fani fade into the background. You are far from those shadows now. The air around you is calm. Breathe in the stillness. Breathe out the day. We will follow the path into the darkness in the chapters to come, but for this moment, let yourself simply exist in the quiet that follows the storm. The transition from the chaos of the street to the suffocating stillness of the apartment was a journey made in the trunk of a car, a space where the smell of gasoline and old upholstery pressed against the senses. When the vehicle finally came to a rest, the world was no longer defined by the wide Roman sky, but by the narrow, sterile confines of Via Camillo Montalcini No. 8. This was a nondescript apartment complex in a residential corner of the city, a place where the ordinary sounds of neighbors clinking coffee spoons and children laughing in the hallways provided a haunting soundtrack to a kidnapping that had just shattered the peace of the entire nation. Inside the first-floor apartment, the air was cool and smelled faintly of floor wax, and the metallic tang of a space that had been prepared with clinical, cold-hearted efficiency. A false wall had been meticulously constructed behind a large bookcase, creating a secret room that was no more than a few square meters in size. This windowless box, which the Red Brigades called the prison of the people, was where the most powerful man in Italy was now meant to disappear. The lighting was harsh and artificial, casting long, sharp shadows against the plywood walls that still carried the raw, woody scent of recent construction. As the first night of his captivity bled into the morning of March 17, 1978, a profound and heavy silence fell over the country. It was as if Italy had collectively held its breath. The news had traveled with the speed of a lightning strike, turning the usual morning bustle of the city into a scene of frozen disbelief. In bars and cafes, where the clatter of porcelain usually dominated the air, people stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on television sets that flickered with grainy black and white images of the blood-stained pavement of Via Fani. Schools were abruptly emptied, and students walked home through streets that felt suddenly alien, watched over by carabinieri who stood at every corner with their hands tight on their weapons. The government, led by Giulio Andreotti, moved with a frantic yet rigid energy. A general strike was called, and 16 million workers walked off their jobs, not in protest of a policy, but in a massive, silent demonstration of grief and shock. Factories stood silent, their great gears grinding to a halt, and the ports of Italy became graveyards of unmoving ships. The nation was at a standstill, waiting for a sign from the shadows where their leader had been taken. Inside the hidden room in Via Montalcini, the passage of time became a distorted, fluid concept. For Aldo Moro, the world was now reduced to a single cot, a small wooden table, and the looming presence of the Red Brigades flag that hung behind him. The flag was a deep, aggressive crimson, and the five-pointed star inside its white circle seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. The silence of the apartment was occasionally broken by the muffled sounds of his captors moving on the other side of the false wall, their voices low and urgent. On March 18, the first official communication from the group was discovered in a trash bin in the heart of Rome. It was a single, typed sheet of paper that they called Communiqué Number 1. The language was cold, steeped in the militant rhetoric of class warfare, and it announced to the world that Aldo Moro would be subjected to a people's trial. It was a declaration that they did not just want to hold him, but to judge the entire political system he represented. The demand was not for money or for a plane to a distant land, but for a total recognition of their revolutionary cause. They were putting the state itself on trial, and the prize was the life of the man who had tried to bridge the impossible gaps of Italian politics. The atmosphere across the country shifted from shock to a simmering, pervasive panic. The authorities launched a manhunt of a scale never before seen in the history of the Republic. Over the first week, 72,000 roadblocks were established across the country, turning the winding roads of the Italian peninsula into a labyrinth of checkpoints and flashing blue lights. More than 13,000 police officers were mobilized, and 40,000 private homes were searched in a desperate attempt to find a needle in a haystack of Roman apartments. In the Vatican, Pope Paul VI, a longtime personal friend of Moro, sat in a state of deep mourning, his prayers echoing through the silent halls of the Apostolic Palace. The streets of Rome, usually alive with the scent of exhaust and roasting chestnuts, now smelled of wet pavement and the tension of an impending storm. Every siren that wailed in the distance caused people to stop and look toward the horizon, wondering if the nightmare was ending or just beginning. But despite the massive show of force, the investigators were chasing ghosts. The apartment on Via Montalcini remained a silent fortress, invisible to the thousands of eyes searching for it, while the man inside began to realize that his ordeal would not be measured in hours, but in weeks of psychological warfare. As the first 7 days drew to a close, the psychological weight of the captivity began to settle into the very walls of the secret cell. The captors, led by Mario Morti, began their interrogation, a process they documented with the clinical detachment of a recording. Moro, a man of profound intellect and deep faith, found himself trapped in a debate where the rules were written in blood. He was allowed to write letters, his pen scratching against the paper in the dim light, his words a bridge cast into the void toward a government that was already beginning to debate whether it should respond at all. The initial disbelief of the public was curdling into a dark, cynical dread. People began to realize that the state was being forced into a corner where every choice led to a different kind of tragedy. The air in Rome grew colder as March progressed, and the shadows in the apartment on Via Montalcini seemed to grow longer with every passing hour. The first week of the 55 days had ended, and the silence that followed was no longer the silence of shock, but the heavy, expectant silence of a nation preparing itself for a long and agonizing wait. The trial had begun, not just in the hidden room, but in the hearts of everyone who watched the news, wondering if the republic they knew could survive the trial of its most vital architect. The air inside the small, soundproofed room in the apartment on Via Camillo Montalcini was thick and stagnant, smelling of stale dust, and the faint, metallic scent of the radiator that hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration. Aldo sat at the small, makeshift table, his shoulders hunched as if bearing the physical weight of the silence. In front of him lay a stack of lined paper and a simple ballpoint pen, tools that felt strangely heavy in his hands. The light from the single, unshaded bulb above cast long, trembling shadows across the desk, flickering whenever the electricity wavered. Every stroke of the pen was a jagged line of survival, a thin thread of blue ink tethering him to the world that continued to turn outside those reinforced walls. He could hear the muffled sounds of his captors moving in the adjacent room, the occasional scrape of a chair or the low murmur of voices. But within his wooden box of a cell, the only sound was the scratch of metal on paper. It was a rhythmic, lonely sound, echoing the frantic beating of a heart that refused to accept the finality of its cage. This was the beginning of his correspondence, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between a prisoner and a nation. His first letters were addressed to his wife, Eleonora, whom he called Noretta. As he wrote her name, his hand trembled, the tip of the pen digging deep into the paper. He described the texture of his isolation, not through the politics of his capture, but through the lens of a husband and father who was being erased. He wrote of the cold that seemed to seep into his bones during the long nights of 1978, and the way he tried to conjure the smell of their home to mask the scent of his captivity. He told her to stay strong, to keep the children close, and to remember the warmth of their shared life. The ink on these pages was often blurred by the moisture of his breath, or perhaps the dampness of the room itself. To Noretta, he was not a statesman or a symbol. He was a man who missed the simple ritual of a morning coffee and the sound of a key turning in a familiar lock. These messages were intended to be private, a sanctuary of words, but he knew they would be read by the cold eyes of his captors before they ever reached her hands. The intimacy was violated before it was even delivered, yet he poured his soul into the lines, hoping that some essence of his true self would survive the journey through the dark channels of the Red Brigades. But as the days stretched into weeks, the tone of the ink began to shift. The tenderness for his family remained, but a sharp, urgent edge developed in his messages to his political colleagues. He wrote to Francesco Cossiga, the Interior Minister, and to Benigno Zaccagnini, the Secretary of the Christian Democrats. In these letters, the handwriting became tighter, more controlled, reflecting a mind that was meticulously dissecting the political reality of his situation. He spoke of the reason of state versus the value of a human life. He argued that his death would not serve the Republic, but would instead leave a permanent, bleeding wound on the soul of Italy. He used phrases that were both a plea and a warning, suggesting that the government's refusal to negotiate was not a sign of strength, but a failure of imagination and humanity. He mentioned that he was being tried by a people's court, and that his secrets, the secrets of 30 years of governance, were being extracted piece by piece. The paper seemed to vibrate with his frustration as he realized that his friends in the high offices of Rome were choosing a path of absolute firmness, a silence that felt to him like a premature eulogy. The delivery of these letters was a macabre ritual. The captors would take the finished pages, often 5 or 6 sheets of dense, handwritten prose, and leave them in public places across the cities of Rome, Milan, and Genoa. They were found in trash bins, tucked behind the pipes of public fountains, or left in the offices of major newspapers. Each time a new letter was discovered, a wave of tension rippled through the country. The public saw the handwriting and recognized the familiar, elegant script of their former prime minister, now distorted by the pressure of his ordeal. The state, however, reacted with a chilling skepticism. Officials began to whisper that the letters were not truly his, that they were written under duress, or that he had been brainwashed by his captors. They analyzed the syntax and the word choices, looking for signs of a broken mind rather than a desperate heart. This was perhaps the deepest cruelty of his captivity. As he sat in the dim light, pouring his intellect and his anguish into the ink, the very people he had spent his life leading were beginning to treat his words as if they were the ramblings of a ghost. One of the most poignant appeals was sent to Pope Paul VI. Aldo and the Pope had been friends for decades, and in his letter, the prisoner reached out for a divine intervention that the secular world seemed determined to deny him. He wrote of his soul, of the weight of the sins of a nation, and of the need for a gesture of mercy that transcended the cold logic of politics. He imagined the Pope reading his words in the vast, quiet halls of the Vatican, a world of marble and history that felt light years away from the cramped, airless cell on Via Camillo Montalcini. The ink on this letter was precise, respectful, yet filled with a profound loneliness. He was a man standing on the edge of a great abyss, looking back at the light and begging for someone to reach out. But outside, the policy of firmness held fast. The government stayed silent, the streets remained patrolled by thousands of soldiers, and the letters continued to arrive like messages in bottles thrown into a stormy sea. Each one was a testament to a man who refused to be silenced, even as the walls of his prison seemed to grow closer with every passing hour, and the ink of desperation began to run dry. The year 1978 felt like a heavy, velvet curtain had fallen over the city of Rome. Inside the thick, 16th-century walls of Palazzo Chigi, the air was dense with the scent of bitter espresso and the lingering, gray ghost of cigarette smoke that clung to the heavy tapestries. The halls, usually bustling with the frantic energy of Italian bureaucracy, had grown unnervingly quiet. Only the rhythmic, metallic echo of footsteps on cold marble broke the silence as aides carried stacks of folders between grand rooms. In the golden drawing room, the shadows stretched long and thin across the ornate floors, reaching toward the men who sat in high-backed chairs of polished wood. They were the architects of the state, dressed in suits of charcoal wool, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a crisis that had no easy exit. Outside, in Piazza Colonna, a fine, misty rain began to fall, slicking the cobblestones and making the 2,000-year-old column of Marcus Aurelius glisten like bone under the streetlights. The world was waiting for a word, a signal, a crack in the resolve of the government, but inside those rooms, a cold and calculated stillness had taken root. This was the birth of what would be known as the line of firmness, an iron-willed refusal to bend, even as the life of one of their own hung in the balance. The logic of the line of firmness was as sharp and unforgiving as a razor's edge. It was championed by the Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, and supported with surprising vigor by the leader of the Communist Party, Enrico Berlinguer. For these men, the kidnapping was not just a human tragedy. It was a direct assault on the heart of the Republic. They believed that if the state negotiated with the Red Brigades, it would be a surrender of its very legitimacy. To trade the life of Aldo Moro for the release of 13 imprisoned terrorists was, in their eyes, a price that would bankrupt the moral authority of the law. They feared that a single concession would ignite a firestorm of further kidnappings, turning Italy into a playground for chaos. This was the historic compromise in its most tragic form, a moment where the two largest political forces in the country, once bitter rivals, stood shoulder to shoulder in a wall of silence. They spoke of the superior interest of the state, a phrase that sounded noble in the echoes of the parliament, but felt like a death sentence when whispered in the hallways of the Moro family home. The atmosphere in those high offices was one of clinical detachment, a belief that the individual must be sacrificed so the institution could survive. They looked at the list of 13 names provided by the kidnappers and saw not a path to peace, but a trap door into anarchy. But not everyone could maintain that icy distance. In a different part of the city, the air in the offices of the Socialist Party felt much hotter, charged with the frantic energy of dissent. Bettino Craxi, the young and ambitious socialist leader, began to weave a different narrative. He spoke of the line of negotiation, a desperate search for a humanitarian loophole. He didn't want to destroy the state, but he couldn't stomach the idea of watching a man be executed while the government watched from the sidelines. The tension between these two factions, the hardliners and the negotiators, ripped through the political fabric of Italy like a jagged blade. In the quiet corners of cafes, people argued over their morning papers, their voices low and urgent. Is a state truly strong if it allows its most faithful servant to die? Is a life worth more than a principle? While the politicians debated, the Moro family lived in a state of suspended animation. The smell of wax candles and the sound of constant, hushed prayers filled their home. Eleonora Moro, Aldo's wife, was a woman of quiet strength, but her letters to the government began to take on a sharper tone. She could see the machinery of politics beginning to grind her husband into dust, and she fought against the coldness of the firmness with every ounce of her being, begging for a gesture, a sign, a single human act in a world of rigid protocols. Inside the small, cramped confines of the so-called People's Prison, Aldo Moro was becoming painfully aware of the silence from the outside world. The room was a tiny cell, perhaps no larger than a walk-in closet, with walls covered in soundproofing material that swallowed every noise. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb that cast a harsh, sickly yellow glow over his bed and the small desk where he was permitted to write. He could hear the muffled, distorted sounds of the city through the vents, but they felt like they were coming from another planet. The air was stale, smelling of dust, and the metallic tang of the typewriter he used to compose his 86 letters of captivity. As the days stretched into weeks, the tone of his writing shifted from diplomatic appeals to a raw, searing sense of betrayal. He realized that his friends, the men he had mentored, the men he had shared meals with for 30 years, were the ones holding the door shut. He wrote with a pen that felt heavy as lead, describing himself as a man already dead, a ghost wandering through a political nightmare. He warned them that his blood would fall upon their heads, that the line of firmness was actually a line of cowardice. The physical sensation of being a bargaining chip that nobody wanted to trade was a psychological torture more profound than any physical blow. As the 50-day mark approached, the stalemate reached a fever pitch. The Red Brigades, frustrated by the government's lack of response, began to release increasingly grim communiques. The public was caught in a strange, hypnotic trance, watching the news every hour for any update. The streets of Rome felt thin, as if the reality of the city was wearing out. At night, the police sirens wailed through the fog, a constant reminder of the thousands of officers searching fruitlessly for a hidden apartment in a city of millions. The government stayed its course, their faces becoming masks of stoicism. They were betting everything on the hope that the terrorists would blink first, that the pressure of the search would force them to release Moro without a trade. But the kidnappers were not blinking. They were waiting in their own silence, watching the clock tick down. The line of firmness had become a cage, not just for Moro, but for the entire nation. It was a test of will where the prize was a man's life, and the cost was the soul of the country. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the Vatican and the shadows of the pines on the Janiculum Hill grew long, the question remained. How much longer could the state remain silent before the silence itself became a scream? The morning of April 18, 1978, broke with a chilling uncertainty that seemed to settle over Rome like a heavy, damp blanket. It was on this day that the already fraying nerves of a nation were pushed toward a breaking point. A leaflet, appearing to be the 7th communiqué from the Red Brigades, was discovered tucked away in the shadows of the city. The words printed upon it were cold, final, and devastating. It claimed that the trial of Aldo Moro was over, that he had been executed by suicide, and that his mortal remains had been consigned to the depths of Lake Duchessa. This message did not carry the usual clinical tone of the previous manifestos. It felt jagged, a sharp blade meant to sever the last threads of hope. The choice of the word suicide was a calculated cruelty, a psychological barb designed to twist the knife in the hearts of his family and the public. As the news rippled through the corridors of power and the dusty squares of the capital, a frantic, desperate energy took hold. There was no time to verify the authenticity of the claim, no space for the quiet contemplation of the source. The state had to act, and they had to act with a visible, crushing force to prove that they could still reach into the dark places of the earth to bring their leader home, even if only in shadow. Far from the humid, tension-choked streets of Rome, the search moved into the rugged, unforgiving heart of the Apennines. Lake Duchessa sat like a secret, a small eye of water hidden high within the Velino Duchessa mountain range, nearly 2,000 meters above the level of the sea. To reach it was not a simple task of driving down a paved road. It required a grueling ascent through a landscape that seemed to actively resist human intrusion. A convoy of dark, heavy vehicles wound its way through the jagged arteries of the mountains, their tires crunching against the gravel and the hardening frost of the high altitude. Hundreds of men, soldiers and police officers alike, were mobilized into the thin, biting air. As they climbed, the world of politics and urban struggle fell away, replaced by the sheer, vertical reality of rock and ice. The wind howled through the limestone crags, a lonely, spectral sound that mimicked the rising anxiety of the country. Every step upward was a struggle against the elements, a physical manifestation of the labyrinthine search for the truth that had characterized the last 33 days. The men moved in a grim procession, their breath blossoming in white clouds before their faces, eyes fixed on the distant, white-capped peaks where the lake lay in its frozen cradle. When the search parties finally crested the ridge and looked down upon Lake Duchessa, they did not find a placid body of water. They found a wasteland of white. At that altitude, in the middle of April, the lake remained locked behind a thick, impenetrable shield of ice. It was a surreal sight, a vast, flat mirror of frost surrounded by snow-dusted slopes, silent and seemingly eternal. There was something profoundly haunting about the scene. It felt less like a crime scene and more like an ancient, desolate graveyard. The authorities did not hesitate. They brought in artificers, men trained to handle the volatile energy of explosives, to break the silence of the mountains. The sound of the first detonations echoed through the valleys like thunderclaps, shattering the crystalline peace of the high country. Shards of ice flew into the air, falling back with a metallic clatter against the frozen surface. Once a hole was cleared, the divers prepared to enter. They stood on the edge of the dark, churning water, their black rubber suits slick and gleaming under the pale mountain sun. They looked like creatures from another world, prepared to descend into a void that held no warmth and no light. As they slipped beneath the surface, the crowd of onlookers above fell into a heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of oxygen pumps and the distant, lonely cry of a mountain bird. Beneath the ice, the water was a murky, freezing world of shadows. The divers felt their way through the silt, their gloved hands searching the bottom for anything that might resemble a human form. The visibility was nearly zero, a clouded soup of mud and ancient organic matter that had rested undisturbed for centuries. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. Above them, the ice groaned and shifted, a reminder of the weight of the world they had left behind. Hour after hour passed, and the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. The search was as much a trial of endurance as it was an investigation. Despite the hundreds of men combing the shoreline and the divers scouring the depths, they found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence of any human presence at all. The lake was empty, a silent witness that had been falsely accused. As the realization began to sink in, the physical cold seemed to seep deeper into the bones of the searchers. The futility of the effort was becoming undeniable. They were chasing a ghost in a place where only the wind and the stones lived, while the real clock continued to tick in a hidden room back in the city, far from the mountain heights. The deception was finally unmasked on April 20, when the genuine communiqué number 7 was delivered by the Red Brigades. It was accompanied by a photograph, a haunting image of Aldo Moro holding a copy of the newspaper La Repubblica from the previous day, the 19th of April. He was alive. The mountain search had been a grand, elaborate distraction, a masterwork of misinformation designed to humiliate the state and spread confusion. The fake communiqué had been the work of a professional forger, a man named Antonio Ciccarelli, whose ties to the underworld of Rome suggested a much deeper and more sinister layer of conspiracy than many were willing to admit. The nation had been led into the mountains to stare into a frozen lake while the captors remained hidden in the very heart of the capital. This incident, which became known as the Depistagio of Lake Duchessa, served a dual purpose. It exhausted the resources of the police, and more cryly, it desensitized the public. For a few brief days, Italy believed Moro was dead, and when he was found to be alive, the relief was tempered by a growing sense of fatigue. The kidnappers were playing a psychological game of cat and mouse, stretching the tension until it became a background noise, a dull ache that the public was beginning to learn to live with. The false lake was not just a geographic detour. It was a map of the confusion that was beginning to swallow the entire case. As the searchers began the long descent from the Velino Duchessa Massif, packing their equipment and leaving the ice to heal over its wounds, the atmosphere in Rome shifted. The reprieve of knowing Moro was still breathing was short-lived, replaced by an even sharper realization of the captors' sophistication. They had shown they could control the narrative, that they could lead the entire apparatus of the state into the wilderness on a whim. While the police had been busy with explosives and diving gear in the high altitudes, the real movements of the Red Brigades had continued unchecked in the narrow alleys and nondescript apartment blocks of the city. The stalemate was no longer just a political one. It was a deep, psychological trench. Moro remained in his small, lightless cell, perhaps hearing the muffled sounds of the city through the walls, unaware of the thousands of men who had just spent 48 hours searching for his ghost in a mountain lake. The clock was no longer just ticking, it was echoing. The authorities, stung by the humiliation of the false search, began to harden their resolve even further, their embarrassment turning into a rigid, unyielding stance that would leave very little room for negotiation as the final days of the 55-day ordeal began to loom on the horizon. The morning of May 9th, 1978, arrived in Rome with a heavy, suffocating warmth. The city, usually vibrant with the chaotic music of motors and shouting vendors, felt strangely suspended, as if the air itself were holding its breath. In a quiet apartment, the sharp, rhythmic trill of a telephone shattered the silence. Franco Tritto, a close assistant to Aldo Moro, reached for the receiver with a hand that had grown accustomed to trembling over the past 54 days. The voice on the other end was cold, detached, and chillingly precise. It did not offer a greeting. It simply delivered a set of coordinates, a final instruction that would end the longest winter in Italian history. The caller told him to go to Via Michelangelo Chitani. He said to look for a red Renault 4. The line went dead, leaving behind only the hollow hum of the dial tone and the crushing weight of a certainty no one wanted to face. Outside, the Roman sun began to climb, casting long, sharp shadows across the ancient cobblestones, unaware that it was illuminating the final act of a national tragedy. Via Kitani is a narrow, somber vein of a street, tucked away in the historic heart of the city. It is a place where the walls are thick with the dust of centuries, and the light struggles to reach the ground. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, a small, unassuming red car was noticed by the authorities. It sat hunched against the curb, its vibrant primary color looking garish and out of place against the muted ochre and gray of the surrounding buildings. The car, a Renault 4, bore the marks of a long journey, its tires coated in a fine, pale dust. The police cordoned off the area with yellow tape that fluttered lazily in the slight breeze, and a heavy, respectful silence descended. The crowd that gathered stayed back, their faces etched with a mixture of dread and exhausted hope. There was no shouting, no pushing. Only the sound of distant church bells tolling the hour and the soft, metallic click of cameras as photographers documented the vehicle that had become a casket on wheels. When the trunk was finally eased open, the world seemed to tilt. There, nestled in the cramped darkness of the rear compartment, lay Aldo Moro. He was dressed in the same gray wool suit he had been wearing on that violent morning in March, though it was now wrinkled and bore the stains of his long captivity. He was curled in a near-fetal position, his head resting toward the back of the car, covered partially by a simple, striped blanket. His eyes were closed, his expression one of profound, weary peace, as if he had finally been allowed to sleep after a lifetime of carrying the weight of a nation. But the peace was an illusion. Beneath the fabric, his chest was riddled with 11 bullet wounds from a 9mm Walther and a 7.65mm Scorpion. The air inside the car was thick with the scent of spent gunpowder and the faint, salty tang of the sea. It was a sight that would burn itself into the collective memory of Italy, a visual punctuation mark at the end of an era of compromise. As the forensic teams moved in, they discovered small, baffling details that added layers of mystery to the tragedy. In the cuffs of Moro's trousers and inside his socks, they found traces of fine sand and small fragments of shells, as if he had recently walked upon a beach. There were bits of bitumen, the kind used to pave coastal roads, clinging to his shoes. The kidnappers would later claim they had scattered these materials to mislead the investigators, to suggest a prison by the sea that never existed. Yet the physical presence of the shore inside that dark trunk felt like a cruel irony, a hint of the vast, open horizon for a man who had spent his final weeks trapped in a small, windowless room. The location of the car itself was the most potent symbol of all. Via Kitani sat almost exactly halfway between the headquarters of the Christian Democrats in Piazza del Gesù and the headquarters of the Communist Party in Via del Bottega Oscure. By leaving him there, the captors had staged a final, gruesome tableau. A literal and figurative dead end for the historic bridge Moro had tried to build between two worlds. The news rippled through Italy like a seismic wave. In the hours that followed, the streets of Rome became corridors of grief. Shops lowered their shutters, and the usual clamor of the cafes faded into hushed whispers. People stood on street corners, clutching newspapers with headlines that seemed too heavy to hold. The death of Aldo Moro was more than the loss of a statesman. It was the death of a certain kind of hope. The years of lead had reached their terrifying zenith, leaving the country to grapple with the realization that even its most protected and visionary leaders were vulnerable to the shadows. In his final letters, Moro had spoken of his family, of his wife Noretta, and of a desire for a private, quiet funeral. He wanted no politicians, no state honors, no speeches from the men who had refused to negotiate for his life. He sought only the stillness he had been denied in his final 55 days. His request was honored, and he was laid to rest in the small village of Torrita Tibrina, far from the halls of power and the narrow, haunted stretch of Via Kitani. Tonight, as we look back across the decades, the image of that red car remains a ghost in the Italian psyche. The questions linger in the corners of the mind, questions about what was known, what was hidden, and the price of political stability. But for now, those questions can wait. The sun has set over the Tiber, and the shadows have reclaimed the narrow streets where history once held its breath. The echoes of the sirens have long since faded, replaced by the soft, steady rhythm of the night. We leave the statesman to his rest and the secrets to the earth. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.